Bonjour, my lovelies. My name is Adrielle. I'm an American living in Paris, and today we're going to be talking about the cost of living in Paris in 2023. But before we get into it, if you want to stay in the know on all things Paris, style, and beauty, please subscribe to my channel and make sure you hit the notification bell so you get notified of each new video. That said, let's get into it. Today, we are going to be talking about the cost of living in Paris. What I'm going to do is I will start off by discussing it in terms of housing, then we can talk about it in terms of food, groceries, and dining out, and then we'll also touch on healthcare and just miscellaneous expenses in general. The thing is because I am an American, my best source of comparison is going to be the US because that's the only place I've lived up until now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be comparing it to costs and expenses in the US. This will also be helpful if someone is looking to move to the US, right? You'll get a sense of how much more expensive it is to live in the US than it is to live in France. Let's start off with housing. Housing was the largest decrease in my cost of living, okay? So let me give you some comparison for context. When I lived in Washington, D.C., I lived in the center of the city in a high-rise building. I paid about $3,000 a month for rent, and I lived in a studio apartment, which was right about 400 square feet. Not that much space, right? Compare that with Paris. In Paris, I pay about $1,700 a month for rent, and I have double the amount of space. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment. It's right about 800 square feet, and it's almost half the rent as what I was paying in DC. That is an astronomical jump. That's an astronomical leap. And the thing is, you have to remember that Paris is the most expensive place, in France to live. So if I were to move like outside of Paris and I were to live kind of someplace else in not just the suburbs of Paris, but like in a smaller town or a smaller city, I could probably get a 2-bedroom apartment for $1,000 a month, right? It's just crazy how much you can decrease your housing expenses by living here in France. It was insane to me. So that's one of the things I absolutely love about living in France, which is this decrease in the housing expenses. Now, of course, the one thing to keep in mind is that, you have a decrease in salary when you live in France versus the US. So the thing is while my American money might be able to go much further here in France, it is harder for example, a Parisian to be able to kind of get an apartment like this because you have to make 3 times as much in terms of like what you're making each month. And that can be kind of hard. That's like a pretty good salary if you're making that. So there's some comparison to that. I'm noting that it was easy for me to get into that. It was kind of a better situation for me financially, but that is in comparison to the fact that I'm using US money to pay for a French apartment. And if you want to know how difficult it is to get a French apartment, take a look at my video on how to move to Paris, part 2, I think it is, on housing. It's a grind. But the point is I still decrease my housing expenses when I moved here. Next, let's talk about food. So when it comes to food, I'm going to split it into 2 categories. One, groceries, and then the second, I'll just talk about dining out. As far as grocery expenses, I would again say I decreased this by half to 3/4 then versus what I was paying in the US. So for example, I'll give you a story I love to tell people. When I was in the US, I always frankly bought food that was organic because I didn't want food with a lot of pesticides, etc. So as a result, I often shopped at Whole Foods for that sort of food. I'll never forget once being at Whole Foods and an apple costing $1. $1. Now compare that to being in France where I go to the market and I can get 10 potatoes for $1. You see the difference? In France, you have access to very high quality food for not a lot of money. Food is very accessible here, and high quality food is very accessible. It's not something that's just for the rich, which is what I feel like it is very much in the US. anyone can really get access to quality food here. That's why I think living here from a food perspective is just really, really phenomenal, because you get access to this really high quality food and it's not super expensive. So to give you some perspective, I would say I spend at least, $400 to $500, maybe even $600 a month on groceries in the US. That's because I was buying kind of organic and that's just so expensive. Whereas here, I can go to the market and get enough food to feed my boyfriend and I for 3 days for, max 10 euros, right? And that is assuming that I don't go too crazy. Now, obviously, meats are more expensive, right? So fruits and vegetables are relatively easy to get at a very good price. Obviously, meat, fish is going to be a little bit more expensive, but the point is it's still better quality food than what I'm getting in the US, and it's still less than what I'm paying in the US. So at the end of the month in food for 2 people, we're spending, 300 euros, $300 max. And that's for 2 people, right? So think about that. Think about how much I had to decrease my food consumption. In the US, it was one person I was feeding for $500. And in France, we're feeding 2 people on $300 a month. That's insane. So it just shows you how much, the difference is between the cost of food in the US versus in France. Now let's also talk about eating out. Actually, a lot of times in France, it is cheaper to eat out than it is to cook at home. So you can find really phenomenal, high quality meals, for a very reasonable price. Very often wine, for example, you can go someplace and you can get wine for 3 euros, where you would pay more for that for a soda, right? You pay more for that for Coke. It's really quite phenomenal that even when you go out to eat, you're just not spending as much money as you would in the US. So in the US, I might go on a brunch on Sunday, and brunch might cost, a slight fortune, right? We might end up spending $100 per person. Whereas here, I can go have brunch and I'm going to pay 30 euros per person or 25 euros per person. Obviously, it's really going to vary though when it comes to food and eating out. That's the one thing to keep in mind. If you're eating at Michelin star restaurants every day, the cost of dining out is going to be absurd, right? However, if you're not looking to do that, if you're really focusing on eating, more medium range places, more reasonably priced places, then basically you can generally eat out. Eating out is affordable. It's not something that is just a luxury and something that, when you do it, it's going to cost you a fortune to do. So let's also talk about healthcare. From healthcare perspective, oh my gosh, this cost has dropped to almost nothing a month. Healthcare, as I have talked about in some of my other videos, healthcare is provided for by the government. It is considered a human right, and so it is not a business here in France. So as a result, my healthcare expenses, are negligible. So for example, if I need to go to the doctor, let's say the price for the doctor is 25 euros, the government might reimburse 20 euros of that, and so I only have to pay 5. But the thing is if you invest in private health insurance, that will cover the gap between what the government pays and what you... Do you guys hear that rain? So the private health insurance will cover the gap between what the government pays and then what you might have to pay. So instead of having to pay that 5 euros, your private health insurance will pick that up. In the US, whereas you might pay $200 a month, $300, $400 a month for your private health insurance, right? In France, to get that private health insurance that covers that gap, you're looking at probably $50 a month, maybe even less, right? Maybe if you have some serious complications, it's even more than that. Mine personally is $50 a month, but that's because I chose a plan that was a little bit higher because I didn't know what I was doing. I was just like, I have to select this, and so I'm going to select this, but I'm not entirely certain what's happening. And so I wanted to take a good plan so I could figure out what, if anything, might be the best for me. So I'm paying about 50 euros a month, but I've heard that that's a lot and it actually should be less. we'll see. We'll see. I'm just figuring it out now. So let's also talk about transportation costs, because that is essential when it comes to thinking about cost of living. So in Washington, D.C., I believe I paid about $150 a month for my unlimited monthly pass. In France, they just increased the cost of the monthly pass, and now it's about 79 euros, which I would say converts to about $85 max, 84 probably. So that's still a pretty substantial decrease from what I was paying, right? That's a difference of about $70, right? So I have decreased, again, my transportation expenses by even about 40%. Also in France, I don't have a car, right? So the thing is the train system is very well developed here in Europe. So you can get anywhere you want to go via train, even if you're looking to take a vacation or get out of the city. So basically, I can take a train. I never really need a car, whereas in the US I did have a car, so I had to pay for parking. That was about $500 a month. I of course had to pay for gas, right? That's like 40-50 bucks each time you're filling up your tank. So, assuming you're filling up your tank minimum, 5 times a month, what is that? That's about, $250, maybe $300 per month. And then of course, you have your car note to the extent your car is not fully paid off. So let's say you assume you have a car note of about $400, right? That adds up quite quickly, right? You're well over $1,000 just to have the car each month. So by being able to rely solely on public transport and solely on the train system, that has been phenomenal. And the thing is, a lot of the train system, you can get there with just your Metro card, but even if you need to buy a train ticket, you want to get to a smaller village, you want to get outside of Paris for a day trip or whatnot, that's going to run you about 10 bucks, or it could run you a little bit less, right? It could run you up to 7, or depending upon where you're going, if you're going kind of a ways away, it might take you all the way up to 30 euros each way. But the point is, you're still saving significantly in transportation costs over what you would have been paying in the US on that East Coast. So essentially, if I have to say how much overall have transportation expenses decreased, not just by public transport, oh, then that's been an 80% decrease, right? Because I no longer have to have a car, which is the biggest expense, and I can just take the train. So it has been a huge, huge decrease as far as transportation costs. Let's also talk about utilities, okay? So in utilities, right, we're including the cost of our internet, the cost of our heat, the cost of our water, all of that, et cetera, et cetera. So from a utilities perspective, again, I will say hands down, yeah, decrease. So basically from the phone perspective, it includes phone, home phone, internet, all bunched in together, all of that, I'm paying right about 70 euros a month. So I would say let's round that up to about $75. And that includes everything. It's all this ridiculous package where it's unlimited and all this sorts of stuff. And basically compare that to my Verizon Fios bill in the US, I think was $200 a month. It would drive me crazy. So $75 versus $200. That's more than a 50% decrease right there, right? Just in terms of that expenses. My electricity bill is a flat rate every single month, so I pay $100 each and every single month, and I love that. I don't have to deal with the variability. Electricity in DC, it could vary, right? Some months it was relatively low, it was 50 bucks, and then other months it was $150. It's always varying, but I would say it was probably pretty consistently around $150. So and decrease my electricity expenses, by a good 25%. And that's also been really, really nice as well. So taking utilities as a whole, kind of keeping them all together, again, what are we looking at? A decrease of about, 40% overall, right? I have decreased my cost of living by that much by moving here in France. moving to Paris. So you can see that that has been a substantial decrease. And one of the things that France did is when kind of this energy crisis hit with the war in Ukraine, they capped how much the energy companies could charge people. So as a result, energy costs did not go sky high, and that's why people could still afford to heat their homes in the winter and not go broke. So good job, government. Last but not least, we're going to touch briefly on childcare. I do not have any children, so bear with me. I'm going to give you this information based upon what friends with kids have told me. So essentially, when it comes to childcare, you are entitled to free childcare here in France. Like that is a right. So basically you have free childcare, I believe, starting at the age of 6 months, and the parents can drop off their kids at the center. It's called a creche. You have to sign up for it. They're essentially like the daycares and they watch your kids while you have to go to work, and this is free and this is provided for. And so as a result, a lot of people send their kids to creche, and then school starts actually relatively early for kids, and then they start going to school, and then they're just in school all day. So as far as childcare expenses are nowhere compared to what they are in the US. I once knew a couple where the husband, he worked at a law firm and his wife worked at a nonprofit, and they paid in childcare what his wife made for a year. So I believe she made around $40,000 or $50,000 a year. And that's what they paid every single year in childcare. So imagine going from that to childcare expenses that are maybe, 5,000 euros a year, maybe. And that's if I'm assuming like you have a private nanny or something like that, right? It's again, like you can afford to have those things because childcare for the most part is again not going to be that expensive. You can either put your kid in the free childcare, or you can pay for someone to kind of watch your kid at home. Again, though, it's the price differential, right? Like you're not paying $50,000-$60,000 per kid unless you have some sort of like special nanny, right? Like I don't know, unless you have like Mary Poppins. Like is that who you have? So I can't speak, as I said, too much on childcare, but I'm able to give you just a little bit of a sense, and I hope that that has been helpful. All right, let's also talk about just cost of living in general, just general things, the buying of clothes, etc., right? All I can say here, you all, is just like the cost of living is, it really amazes me how different prices are here versus the US on just the basic things. So things as simple as household goods, costs for sponges and whatnot. There are odd things here that are way more expensive than the US. So for example, I think towels are much more expensive here than the US. I think sheets are much more expensive here than the US. I don't know why. But then other things like soap, I don't think it's as expensive as in the US. And obviously, this is going to vary somewhat based upon whether or not the product is something that is made in France, another EU country, or the US. Because if something is made in the US, you pay a premium for it because you're paying the taxes on it, the duties, etc. Whereas you're buying something that's kind of made and produced in France, it's going to be cheaper because it's right, you're right in the source, you're right close to the source. So that's the thing, is that as far as commodity prices, kind of across the board, those things vary. There are specific categories of things that are definitely more expensive in France than they are in the US. But as an overall, like as a whole, I would say that generally, even still, everything bunched together, you're still paying less for things than you would pay in the US. When I was in the US last summer, I was really surprised and confused because I went to Target with my mom and it was like the shelves were empty. Like we couldn't get stuff. I was like, why are they all out of stock of this? And why are they out of stock of this? And she said, it's been that way almost all year. It's been that way basically since COVID started. And I just couldn't understand that because here in France, we don't all of a sudden have like a shortage of underwear. I can still get that. And so I was really just very confused when I saw how that situation was playing out in the US versus how it's been playing out in France. We can still get access to goods. Our shelves are not empty. Things are just did not just mysteriously disappear overnight that we haven't been able to see again since then. We still have access to kind of the same products we had before COVID, and so we're not dealing with some of the shortages that I think a lot, that I'm seeing a lot in the US and that I frankly experienced when I was back. I also think those shortages are driving up the cost of living in the US, right? Because supply demand, when the supply is low, demand is high, price increases. Whereas in France, since we're not having this supply demand pull, like, yes, the prices have increased because of inflation, but they are still manageable. Like, they're still within the realm of reason. I was, for example, looking at some stuff in the US. I think I was looking at a package of like 5 underwear, Hanes underwear, plain cotton, in Target. And I was just shocked by like how expensive they were. Like, it was just like, it seemed like it was $20 or something like that. And I just thought, that's crazy. I get something so much nicer in France, like for the exact same amount of money. What the heck, right? So you are noticing an increase in prices with inflation, but nothing astronomical, no really astronomically huge jumps like some of what I've been seeing in the US. I will also say that I was born and raised in the middle of the country, right? So I was not kind of raised with the expensive East Coast prices. And I would say that living in France is still cheaper than the life that my parents live in the middle of the country. Like, it's definitely, closer to their life, but it's still even cheaper than that. So I hope that helps you also get a better perspective of how the cost of living is different in France versus the US. So there you have it, a summary of the cost of living differences between France and the US, Paris and Washington, D.C. I hope that has been helpful for you. As a reminder, as I noted, inflation has obviously affected prices here. Things are definitely more expensive than they were before the war. However, we're not dealing with some of the issues that I've noticed, in the US, where just prices have skyrocketed and, people are no longer able to go out and do fun things. We're not dealing with that, so that is really fortunate. That's a blessing because the government has really gotten involved to make sure that that didn't happen to people. Please let me know if you have any questions in the comments. I would love to continue this conversation with you even further. It's just really interesting to me how these differences between the countries exist, and how the cost of living here has just been astronomically so much cheaper for me. All right, thank you so much. With that being said, you have a wonderful day. Stay safe. Peace.